Big thank you, everyone, and to Steph and Brian for letting me hijack this webinar for a whole 2 minutes, I promise, whilst Brian comes in and joins. I've just got some very exciting news to share and thought this would be a good forum for it. So I really just wanted to let you know that the High Walk trial is now looking for volunteers to participate in both Sydney and in Melbourne. If you are a stroke survivor and you're interested, please get in contact. If you work with stroke survivors, then please pass on the good news. So what is the High Walk trial? The High Walk trial is a trial of a high dose program. So it could be up to 3 hours a day, 5 days a week for 3 weeks, aiming to improve walking. The program is led by a physio and we're at 2 locations in Sydney and Melbourne. We are looking for people in the longer term after stroke, so more than 6 months and less than 8 years, who are able to walk but would like to improve their walking. I am happy to be contacted to answer any questions or to share flyers. But as I said, we'd really love to hear from you if you are interested in participating in the High Walk trial and in helping us to spread the word. Again, thank you for hijacking and hope Brian has arrived.
Oops. Thank you very much, Kate. I've shared Brian's mobile number with you. So if you can give him a hand, then hopefully he will be with us soon. So anyway, a very big welcome to everybody that's joining us here tonight, and a very big welcome to Steph. And hopefully we will have Brian Bay joining us soon. So I'll start with an acknowledgement of country, and then Steph and I will introduce ourselves a bit more. So I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal elders and pay my respects to them. The country that I'm on is Gadigal and Wongal country, and they're people of the Eora Nation of the Sydney Basin. Steph, shall I hand over to you for your acknowledgement?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to be speaking to you about the most exciting thing in the world, I think, which is neuroplasticity, actually. And I'd like to also pay my respects and acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in which I am meeting today. And yeah, back to you, Simone.
Okay, so I'll introduce myself a little bit. I'm a physiotherapist by background. My main work now is teaching physiotherapy on an undergraduate physiotherapy program in Sydney, and teaching with the StrokeEd collaboration. And I do some research still around, one of my areas of research is around increasing amounts of practice in rehabilitation. Steph, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Steph, and I'm a stroke survivor. I'm coming to you from Sydney, Australia, for those who might be overseas. Pretty exciting. My stroke happened in 2010 when I was 22. So if you're counting, I'm 35 this year. My stroke occurred through an AVM, which of course I didn't know about. It caused my right-hand side paralysis. And yeah, that basically started a very long and continuing journey. Oh, Brian's here. Wonderful.
I'm here. Oh God, sorry.
Oh, good, Brian. Just happy
the best laid plans, eh?
We just started just doing intros, Brian. So you haven't missed anything. I'll finish mine and then I'll maybe I'll pass it to you. But yes, my stroke was quite severe. Being right-hand side affected, I couldn't walk or use my arm or hand, and because of the stroke, I have now aphasia. So I've had to relearn how to read and write and spell words again and sound out words and speak. Essentially, I was partially blind for a while. But yes, 13 years on, hopefully you can see them much better. But back to you, Brian.
Hi. Hi, Stephanie. Hi, Simone. God,
Hello.
that was a bit of a problem. Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name's Brian Bay. I'm 75 years of age, and 7 years ago, I sustained a very significant left lacuna stroke, which is a stroke involving clots going into the small arteries in the brain. Now, when I commenced rehab after spending 3 days in the ICU, my deficiencies were absolutely no strength on my right side. My brain did not communicate with anything on my right side. The strength was 0 out of 5, hemiparesis, and I had trouble swallowing and speaking. Now, I was in rehab in hospital inpatient care for 4 months. And at the end of 4 months, or 16 weeks, I walked out. And that's where I became aware of the concept of neuroplasticity and how the brain works with prolonged rehab and huge numbers in repetitions, how it does change and it finds a pathway. So even though I'm 7 years on post-stroke, I'm still in rehab. I consider myself still in rehab. It's just that I do my rehab in a slightly different way than in the inpatient situation. And Steph, you do the same thing. I feel as if you do. So, but we'll talk about that tonight as we move on. So now I can sit back and relax and hand back to you, Simone.
Thank you, Brian, and very, very glad to see you here.
Oh yeah, I was getting worried.
Yes. I'm just going to share my
right.
Okay, so just to give an outline of what we're going to cover tonight, we're going to cover issues around timeframes for neuroplasticity. What's the big answer to that one? We're going to talk about what the research tells us about neuroplasticity in terms of the type of practice that needs to be done, which is active task practice, and in great intensity and amounts, and look at issues around engagement with practice. So that's the outline of our talk tonight. I hope we haven't lost Brian. Again, I hope he's going to reappear there. So anyway, I'm going to start with talking about timeframes. There is some quite clear evidence that neuroplasticity happens more easily early after stroke, but even across that evidence, there's not a consistent result in what's been found in that research as to what is the best kind of window of time, if you like. So for example, there's one study that found increased neuroplasticity happening 2 to 3 months after a stroke. There's another study that finds increased neuroplasticity happening within the first 4 weeks after stroke. So it's really, there's no very clear picture there, but I think what is clear is that it's easier to get neuroplasticity early after a stroke. But what we absolutely want to make clear is that there is no endpoint. As far as we know, there is absolutely no endpoint. And we have quite a lot of evidence showing that neuroplasticity can occur also very late after stroke. So I'm just going to share my screen to show you an example of one of the studies that's been done in people later after stroke that has some very clear evidence of neuroplasticity. And then Steph and Brian will talk to some of their examples of changes that they've seen really also much later after their stroke. So this is a study that was done. I'm just checking my notes so I don't get it wrong. But the average of the stroke survivors in this study in terms of time after stroke was 5 years. And the results that are being presented on this person was 9 years after their stroke. And just to explain what they were doing in this study is they were taking people that had a right-sided weakness following a stroke, and they were practicing just moving their right finger, index finger, up and down, and they were doing it to follow a line on a screen. So if you have a look at this, is this stroke survivor who is 9 years after the stroke, and here he's following the line on a screen, and this is before the training program, and you can see that his movement is, fairly sort of uncoordinated. And this is after 20 sessions of training, of practicing, basically doing this movement. You can see that his movement is much smoother and more coordinated. Now, the reason that they practiced this very small activity is because they could ask the stroke survivors to do this movement inside an MRI machine. And so what we have here in the MRI images is what was happening with this stroke survivor, in what was happening in his brain when he tried to do this. So if you have a look at these images, this is the images of his brain before he did the 20 sessions of training. And you can see there's some lighting up here when he tries to move his right index finger. But a lot of that lighting up is actually on the wrong side of the brain. And that happens sometimes after stroke, is that the side opposite the stroke is doing too much, almost. But what you see here, what's very significant, is the changes in his brain activation after those 20 training sessions of this activity. And you can see the stroke here. See that sort of something that looks like a hole almost. That's the site of the stroke. But what you can see in this man's brain after doing those 20 training sessions is there's a lot more activation in his brain. And there's quite a lot of activation now on the left side of the brain, which is where it should be, after all, to move your right index finger. And there's actually quite a lot of activation around where the site of the stroke is, if you look there and there. So that is very clear evidence of changes in the brain happening in somebody who's 9 years after their stroke, with 20 of these training sessions. So there's about 20 roughly 1-hour training sessions. I did have some communication with the author of this research study, and he thinks that in total, that was actually in the order of 7,000 repetitions of that movement, but it was across 20 training sessions. So I'm going to stop sharing there and go to Steph and Brian, who are going to share with us some of the changes that they've seen and that they've seen even much later after their stroke.
Happy for brilliant Brian to go first.
Oh, I was going to say you go first, Stephanie.
Too polite.
Go for it.
Okay.
You go first.
Okay. It's really nice to have Simone as the reasonable voice in this group chat. I'm just going to lay it down really simply, and that is, I'm 13 years on since my stroke, and I'm still improving. There's no doubt about everything I'm doing actively is really paying dividends. Just how much you're willing to actually dedicate yourself to that is a different question. But I suppose for me, I can give you some examples. So I was considered fairly affected, so much so it was considered a huge milestone if I was able to walk well enough to have a slightly independent life where I wouldn't need to be a full risk. But I had bigger plans, and that is to go back to work, etc. I was 22, so I had big dreams. And because I was so severely affected, they had to kind of choose how to dedicate resource to me. So in terms of my upper limb, my hand and arm, I didn't really get any proper attention. So only after coming out of hospital was I able to my family really divert more attention to hand and OT therapy. So I'm bringing this up because we're talking more about 6 months post-stroke did I really start start my rehab for upper limb. And from that point on, I was getting better and better. I was doing a lot of different therapies. I was doing kind of like experimental therapies. I bought some devices. I basically threw everything at it. And yes, I continue to improve. I want to also encourage people that even though you might receive some disappointing news from maybe your doctors sometimes, the running belief, at least from the textbook, is you will receive the biggest amount of recovery in the acute phase. So that's 0 to 3 months up to a year. I would strongly suggest to just take that with a grain of salt and then continue to do as much as you can, because there's actually no way to not see some improvement if you don't do some exercise.
Thank you, Steph.
Brian.
Over to you, Brian.
Wow. I mirror Steph's comments in many parts. As I said, I had a fairly significant stroke myself, and I was confronted with a few deficiencies, and I was told early on that there'd be very little chance that I'd ever walk again, which was to me like a red flag to a bull. I thought, no, I'll teach you. So, and I'm also my philosophy is that the more you do, the better you get. It's a long and winding road. I call it my rehab journey is still on. I'll give you some numbers. I had to learn to walk again, as did Simone, and it is one of the hardest things that I've ever had to do in my life. I'll give you some numbers from inpatient care. In the 16 weeks I was there, I was in the gym for 5 hours 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, and I rattled up something like 26,000 sit to stands, and in excess of 136,000 repetitions on the knee extender, ranging from 35 to 50 degrees down. That was all part of my rehab plan, which is a very measurable plan. I had to build up my strength to be able to achieve the target, which was that I could walk again. And we talk about the evidence, the first evidence you get of neuroplasticity. Well, mine's very clear, because I was sitting on the plinth one day, and one of the physios who would, I was the patient, the corporate patient for the students who had to be assessed by the training officer. So, and we'd just done an assessment with the student physio, and this physio, the training officer, said, try and move your big toe. And up until this point, I had not even considered moving, and I didn't think I could. And I tried, and the axis of movement was like half an inch, a quarter of an inch in either direction. And that was my first evidence of neuroplasticity in action. But then I'll continue on. I'll give you some highlights in my journey since. I can still consider myself in a rehab journey. It was like, I've got some figures here. I'm a bit of a numbers nerd, guys. Tying my shoelaces with my impacted right hand, 3 years and 231 days. Writing legibly with my impacted right hand, 3 years and 321 days. And following a 15-minute session with Carl in my kitchen, using a knife in my impacted right hand to cut my delicious steak, 5 years and 346 days. And it's only recently that I've been able to take a shower by myself. I threw the chair away. So that'll give you an idea of the length of the journey. It doesn't finish when you leave hospital. And there's two words that I refuse to have in my vocabulary. One is wallow, you go home and wallow, and two is plateau. You should never, ever talk to a clinician, or a clinician should never say those words, or a patient should never hear them, and that is the word plateau, because you don't. Yeah, and the more you do, the stronger you get, the faster you can do things, and that fertilizes motivation. So yeah, there's my examples.
So I think so. Obviously, the big wrap up on time frame is that there is no endpoint. That is
absolutely no endpoint. Yeah,
strong message here. Now, our next message is about what do you need to do to get neural plasticity in the brain, and what you absolutely need to do is active task practice. And I'm going to hand over to Steph to define what is meant, particularly by the active part of that.
That's right. So I soon realized that there was a real difference between what can be seen as therapy to what is actually going to make a difference to your recovery. So a big message I want you to remember is it all starts and ends in your brain. It's not like a broken bone. It's not like if you just wait for a while, it's going to mend itself. It's something that you need to actually really earn. Unfortunately, I often say that rehab, it's almost like doing a really complex and hard math task or question. If I'm not really concentrating and focused on the task at hand, then the I guess exercise is kind of futile. The most important thing about rehab is you need to really understand what needs to happen and then execute that. It needs to be active. Now, that's in theory. I may as well show you an example. So if I share my screen, I can show you a bit better. Please let me know when you can see my screen.
Yep, we're seeing your screen.
Yep.
Great.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So to give an example.
Oh, Steph, we're not in your upper limb practice though. Was that?
Oh dear.
Yes,
That's not good.
We're in something that looks like it might be delights, I think.
That's a bit of work. That's not right.
Oh dear.
Okay.
This
there
is
you are. That's it.
Yeah, okay. That's better. Sorry about that. Okay. So can you see myself in some tennis balls? That's better? Okay. To further illustrate neuroplasticity, and then on the first point of there's no time frame, is this was conducted in 4 years post-stroke. So most people would actually start not really thinking about rehab anymore, but I still had a lot of limited use. I had problems with grasping. So this is where I started. You can see a bit of tape on my fingers, and there's it's kind of just assisted me with the grasping, but not a lot. So again, I'm really actively focused on the task itself. So what happened after, when I got better, the next thing was, again, trying to make sure that I'm actively challenging myself. So we moved on to smaller objects like marbles, which are heavier, smaller, of course, but also slipperier. If that's a word. You can see that my rubber grasp is not very good, and thumb and index are not really working together. And this is this second video is basically two weeks after from the first one. So there have been a lot of hours put in. And then this is triumphantly after a month of doing this exercise. This is what happened. Yeah, a lot better. My wrist extension, a lot better. My control is better. So yeah, hopefully gives you that example, just how much it needs to be active and a challenge.
And I think what that is also a very good example of is that we talk about it needing to be active and about it needing to be task practice. But what that can also involve is when a task is too difficult, finding ways of making it easier. So what you can see there in your practice, Steph, is that progression of grasping something bigger and then going on to something smaller and then going on to something, moving something smaller into a much smaller container. So there's that progression. So when we talk about task practice, things should be like normal functional things that you want to be able to do, but where that thing might be too difficult, it can be modified so it can be made easier. The other way that task practice can be made possible too is by doing a component of a task. And I'm going to share some videos of Brian doing some of his exercises to illustrate what we mean by part practice. So in these videos, Brian's practicing at home and he's doing one exercise, which is to improve his balance on his right leg, to improve his walking, and one exercise which is about improving the speed of the swing of his right leg for swinging it through in his walking. So here you can see he's got something that's fairly challenging where he's having to balance on his right leg by stepping his left leg on and off his cookbooks.
Yes.
They were.
Yes. Kandinsky, a Russian art theorist, and the Woman's Weekly Cookbook.
Yes. And here, Brian is, stepping his right foot forward and back, and he's really sort of concentrating on trying to get a heel strike, which was something that was really quite difficult for you at that stage, Brian, trying to land on your heel. So what can also be comprised in that concept of doing active task practice is that a task can be broken into its components. So here, Brian's practicing some components of walking that he's having particular difficulties with in order to improve the task of walking. And I think the other active practice that often needs to be done is where muscles are very weak, is sometimes just some basic strengthening exercises, which is what Brian's talking about when he was talking about, doing really tens of thousands of repetitions on a tilt table to strengthen his quadricep muscles in order to be able to support his weight better. So, but you can see that it's all very relevant to a particular task that the person, Steph, working on her ability to reach and grasp objects, Brian working on his walking, that task practice is modified in some way to make it achievable, but it's essentially Steph and Brian are doing all that work, switching their muscles on in order to get that neuroplasticity. Which leads us into our next big topic, which is about intensity, that it needs to be active task practice. The next very big issue is that it needs to be done at quite high intensity. So I'm going to hand over to Brian to talk about the concept of big numbers.
Okay, thanks, Simone. About 2 weeks in, it really started about 2 weeks into my inpatient rehab, where I was doing the mandatory hour-and-a-half rehab and then going back to the bed and sort of sitting by the bed for the rest of the day. And two things happened. One was that I was starting to become a bit restless about that. And then the doctor, the consulting surgeon, the Mad Irishman, we called him, said to me as an aside and rounds, he said, "We're going to keep you in here for a couple of months, Brian, and we'll put you back together again." And then I thought, well, if I'm going to be here for a couple of months, I want to be doing something a little bit more than sort of doing reaching and sort of bending exercises. So, and then I went down to the gym and I did my hour-and-a-half, and the physio that I was with, he was there, and we were having a chat, and I was telling him about my frustrations, and he sat down with me and he said some words which have really echoed in my rehab. And he said, "Brian, 20 reps a day ain't going to cut it if you want to do what you want to do." And he said, welcome to the concept of big numbers. And that's when I realized I had confirmation that one, my rehab was going to be prolonged and it was going to involve a massive effort on my part, which I was willing to do, more than willing to do. So then we sat down and we worked out a plan, a quantifiable plan, a measurable plan, which we had weekly targets, and we upped them every week. And as I was talking about, I've already mentioned the 26,000 sit stands. I'd start off my day in rehab with about 300 sit stands just to warm up. And then I think one day I did 1,541 reps on the tilt machine. I was so determined that I was going to prove that doctor wrong. I was going to walk out of the place. Mind you, I had another objective, was when I was going to be discharged, I wasn't going to go out in my jammies or tracksuit. I was going to go out in my corporate, the full corporate gear, which I did. I think, Simone, you were there on that day. I had the business suit with the tie and the cufflinks and all of that. That was my objective. And then it continued on when I got home. And do you want me to talk about my my walking, the steps? Sorry, I can't hear you.
Simone, I think
I'll just share that image. You like if
oh,
you.
great.
Yeah, there we are. This is my walking record. Now, I started walking this route on the 4th of April 2019, and I still do it today. It's become I'm quite a social figure in the neighbourhood. People get to know me, and if I'm not going, they don't see me, they think something's wrong. But this is my walk. I do 2 walks a day, and I do, it's about 3.5 hours now. I'm out at 6 o'clock in the morning and back at 8 o'clock, and the one in the afternoon's about 4 o'clock. But this is where the point that I make is that as well as doing the walking, I can integrate my stepping exercises, because halfway down my walk is Panania railway station, and there's 60 steps up to the platforms. You walk across and 60 steps down, and you do that, and that's the 240 steps that I see there. Now, what I've put here is I have a percentage contact with the handrail, and that's a confidence measure for me. So, yeah, on the 30th of April, I only had to I estimated I held the handrail 50% of my trip up, because bear in mind, it's scary if you're walking upstairs and there's no handrail. Well, I don't do that anymore, because you can quite easily hurt yourself. So as we come down on the 3rd of May, 20%, and on the 4th of May, 0. And of course, Jack Flash comes back the next day, and he's full of confidence. Bang, he stubs his toe and he nearly goes for the thing, and back up to 60%. And but that's an example of the sorts of numbers I do. Now, the other thing is that since the 4th of April till today, I do it 7 days a week. I reckon I've missed in that time 30 days through COVID, wet weather, etc. I've walked I estimated I've walked 18,300 kilometres. Now, if you look at that in distance on the Earth, I've on my way back from the North Pole, because Wikipedia says that the North Pole is 13,500 k's from Sydney. So I'm somewhere in San Francisco walking back. But that gives you an interest. It sort of brings those boring stepping, well, never boring, but it brings that effort and gives it some sort of connection, some sort of reality. So that's the sort of stuff that some of us stroke survivors are confronted with, and I'll keep doing it. And the thing is now, I'll be doing it for the rest of my life. It's such a part of my life now. But then, in addition to that, I'll touch on the integration of other things later on in the presentation. But that's what I do. So when everybody's tucked away in their little beds at 6 o'clock in the morning, there's Brian out there with his hoodie on, and off he goes. But I tell you what, I wouldn't have it any other way. And Steph is the same. She's doing Pilates, 13 years later, post-stroke, and it just demonstrates that neuroplasticity is a great thing, but it's not easily attained. It has to be worked towards.
Over to you, Steph.
Yeah, I want to pause for a second because I'm sure we have a lot of different people online still in their acute phase, and I'm sure a lot of carers and family members. Big numbers sound scary. It's really, really scary actually, because you know the good old rule of like 10,000 hours before you can even specialize in something sounds almost unachievable when, you know, 1 and 2 reps of 10 step ups or squats sound so hard. But I would like to encourage you to start really small, because rehab, ultimately, the ultimate goal is to get back to a good life, whatever that means for you. And a good life means you're independent. And I guess if you start small, you're able to slowly integrate small things into your life. So, for example, what I did, I had really limited use of my right hand, and but through something called constraint-induced movement therapy, or CMT, they were really smart in devising things that were hard but achievable. And those are 2 really important things. Again, I mentioned about the challenge. And they decided that what I could do, albeit still hard, was wipe the table. So don't forget that, you know, forget about the perfect way of doing a thing. Just start somewhere. It could be imperfect, but the fact that you're actually firing up those neurons, that's the important part. So the more I'd practice that, the easier it got. And the more I didn't have to think about it, I just saw that as something that I would just do forever with my affected hand. And then that's the beauty, where it clips over into the everyday factor that we don't have to think about, but in making it more incidental, you're essentially, without you knowing, adding up to those big numbers before you know it. And I'm sure by the 7 days a week, you've already done those 2,000, swipes without even knowing. And I think CIMT really help educate that point with me, that, we usually get that 1 hour a week with the physio or the OT. I don't want you to think that as therapy, but in fact seeing that as the time in which your therapist shows you how this thing needs to be done, and you go home and you start doing it every time. They are professionals, so they'll be able to design something that you can do that is challenging, and just continue to do that, because if you when you start, you will always get better. And I think another really good example of learning that lesson the hard way was, I had a goal of traveling to Europe for the first time, and this is 2 years per stroke. And I knew that if I was balanced enough and I could walk at a certain pace, that I'd be able to book myself a flight to Europe. And I was still pretty diligent, walking 2 hours a day to get to that point where I could walk that well enough. But then I ended up walking on average about 6 hours a day when on tours in Europe. And doing that for, I think, 6 weeks, I came home, and that's when I realized that all that pain in my hip, how rigid everything was, my hyperextension in my knee, for example, that all kind of faded away. And I just realized that, wow, it really does require that much effort and time And, you know, to make you proud, Brian, I think as an estimate, I must have done 20,000 steps to 40,000 steps a day during those 6 weeks. Yeah, and I continue to try and do that too.
That's yeah. I mean, if I can just jump in here, you've made an excellent point there where you say you do so many steps a day, but then you get home and you just don't realise that you've done those steps. And that's the thing with my walking. I don't sort of sit down and say, wow, I've got another half a mile or something, there's another 10,000 steps. I just do it, and then I sit quietly and fill it in and just reflect and say, yeah, you realise you've done it without thinking about it. The other point with me is that I started small, very small. When I got home, I had the Pelican belt, and I could do 4 laps, even though I walked out of the hospital on the discharge. So I did 4 laps of my garage. Then I graduated to the driveway, and then I've got a long driveway, and then around the block and things, and you just build and build and build and build. And that motivates you yourself, because suddenly you're thinking, hell, I'm doing all of this. 2 weeks ago, I couldn't do that, or a month ago, I couldn't do that. And it's sort of like as you go, walk further and stronger and quicker, that motivates you and gets you going and keeps you off that couch in the night.
I think there's some really fantastic points there about intensity. We know that it takes hundreds and thousands of reps, but you can't start that on day one. It takes sort of really building up, and that some of the things that can really help with that is having that, like you're saying, like having those sort of records. I could do this, and now I can do this, and now I can do this. And you've got those records, you can see that progression, and keep building on. And I think this probably leads very well into our last really key principle is about engagement in practice. And that is really critical to get changes in the brain, is that you're engaged in the practice that you do. And in our talks in preparation for this, we really identify that there's probably 2 really, really key things here, is that the practice is relevant to you and your goals, and that it's at the right level of challenge. So who's going first on this one? Who are we up to? Steph, shall we start with you with the right level of challenge, and then we'll come to Brian's magic 3 questions on relevance.
All right.
So I think to further make this even difficult, I guess, you know, we talk about how big numbers are a big part, but I think as a stroke survivor and having gone through rehab for like 10 plus years, I know how hard, but more so how just absolutely boring and mundane it can be. I'm talking about like doing a little, like, you know, sits and stands and little hand exercises. But I really want everyone to know that if you're not actively thinking about it, and it's not a challenge, it doesn't really, like, those synapse fires don't do its job. So what I've used as a bit of a rough rule is something called a 80-20 rule, where if it's not, if I'm able to achieve it 80% of the time, with 20%, you know, where I drop the ball or it's really, really challenging, it's still a good gauge of how it's a good level of a challenging task. I think something that I learned fairly early on is because I know my upper limb was the hardest thing to come back, and I'm still working on it now, but I basically had no flicker of movement. And because, you know, of course, you get desperate. You start looking at other things. I invested in a fairly nice electrical stimulation machine. So the thing where there's two pads and you put it onto your arm, and then the electricity that you kind of like stimulates, that's what it's called, electrical stimulation, to kind of like jolt your brain into thinking, oh, I have an arm, and yes, it still is capable of being moved. But what I realized that I was basically wasting my time doing that without actually actively doing something in tandem, rather than just doing this, say, at home on a couch whilst watching telly. It doesn't really count, because you're not actively thinking about it. It's not challenging. So yes, it needs to be engaging. That's right.
And thank you, Steph. Excuse me. Brian had 3 questions he would ask the physio students he was working with if it wasn't immediately apparent why his practice was or how his practice was relevant to his goals. Brian, would you like to share those 3 questions?
Yeah, these were 3 questions I put to any particularly the students, because we were both on a learning curve, and I would ask them, what is this exercise that you're asking me to do? Tell me about it. What is included in this exercise? And that was the second question. How is it going to impact on my recovery, my stroke recovery, and how is it going to help me to achieve my rehab plan, my overall goal of my rehab plan? So they had to sit down and they had to explain to me that what I was reaching, because that's the first step in standing up, and then you'd stand up, and then that would be part of the journey to walking. So if they could answer that and give me sufficient reasons to those 3 questions, I'd do the exercise. If they could, well, I didn't. I thought we dismissed that as not being useful, and then we moved on to other things. I must admit, with all the physio students we had at Bankstown, they were all able to answer the questions. I don't think I had any occasions where they couldn't answer the question, and it really helped them, because at the end of their tenure there, they all came to me and said how much they enjoyed being questioned. Some of the patients there would sit back and go, oh, well, this is what you want me to do, I'll do it. And quite often, sometimes, Simone talks about relevance, that they were being asked to do things that weren't really relevant in their recovery journey. The other thing that I do is I've learned to integrate my rehab into my everyday life. There is a slide somewhere where I not only, yes, that's it, thanks, mate, there is me wearing my Nautica shorts and T-shirt, sweeping my driveway. Now, that's my impacted right arm there. And as you can see, it's great exercise. I've got a rather long driveway at my place. Then I washed my daughter's car. My car's long since been sold. I wasn't prepared to drive it. Empty the dishwasher. So far I've not broken any of Anne's Villeroy and Bosch dishes. Put the washing on the line, take the washing down, and gardening. And they're all different components of rehab. There's reaching, there's gross functions, fine functions, and it really does work. My reaching in particular has improved incredibly well since I've been putting the washing on the line. The other thing is staying the distance. In order to overcome that boredom and sameness about that, is adopt a marathon mindset. It's as Steph said, it's not going to happen in a week or a day or a month. It may well happen. It may well take you a year or some time like that, and develop a realistic, relevant plan, and learn to accept failures. Learn to accept that, you know, you don't have those, you're not on top of it every day. There are days when I walk when every step is a struggle. I feel as if I get to the top of about 50 metres from the top of the hill, and I wish, oh God, I could turn around and go back. No one will see me, but I'll see myself. So you just learn to push through. There's not every day is a great day. Relevant, realistic goals. Learn to celebrate your achievements. You know, if you've achieved a goal, go and buy it. I go and buy myself a delicious pork roll at the local Vietnamese bakery, yeah, give yourself a treat. You've worked for it. You've attained something. You've attained the goal. And also, if you can, get yourself a rehab buddy, maybe a mentor or a buddy who you can talk to about what you're doing. And that way, you know, that you'll sit back suddenly one day, it'll be 5 years hence, and go, what have I, you know, I've been doing this, and you sit down and you work it out, and you really truly get amazed. And it gets back to that original premise that we were talking about at the beginning of the night. Neuroplasticity is a long-term goal. It's a lot, and I look at my rehab as being an infinite task. It's not a finite task, and it's a long and winding road, but I'm going to be travelling on it for a long, long time. So,
okay, well, thank you very much. I think what I would like to do is to sum up some of the points we've made here, and we have some really fantastic Q&A questions. So just in summary, the take-home messages was that there is no endpoint. Sure, there might be better neuroplasticity in the earlier period after stroke, but there is no endpoint to neuroplasticity. It is reliant on active task practice. It has to be your muscles doing the work, and relevant task practice, or a part of a task, or an easier version of a task. It's reliant on intensity, large amounts of repetitions of practice. And it's reliant on you being engaged, and being engaged, it has to be relevant to you. So ask Brian's questions. If you're not sure why the therapist has given you this particular exercise, ask the questions, because it really should be immediately apparent to you how these exercises are relevant to your goals. And it needs the sweet spot. Steph's sweet spot, the 80-20, 80% success to 20% too difficult. You know, so you've got the right level of challenge. So those are some really key messages there about neuroplasticity and putting it into practice, about what it really means in your rehabilitation. I would like to go over to the Q&A, because we have a stack of questions, and I think it's going to be potentially a bit hard to get through them all, but I think there's some that probably are quite common issues that I'll go to first. And one of them, and I guess, Steph, this might probably something that you've really potentially come up to, is that there's somebody who's said that she's back at work every day for a few hours and has trouble having the hours and the energy to exercise intensively on her work days. Do you have any suggestions?
Oh, well, first of all, congratulations on making it back to work. That's a huge achievement. Actually, in Australia, after a stroke, I think less than 5% go back to work. So that's a huge achievement. I think what you're doing is right. You know, as difficult and frustrating can be, fatigue being a huge but common thing to experience after the stroke, you need to be a little more gentle on yourself. I have to do that a lot to myself. I have to be really flexible. But if I may suggest, to continue to really pace yourself in increasing your hours. you might have goals, but also be realistic and listen to your body. As much as you would like to achieve a higher amount of hours by certain date, I think doing that, pacing yourself, slowly increasing. I went back to work after 2 years, and then I started, I think, 2 hours a day, 3 times a week, and then I built upon that. I just found even showing up to work was exhausting enough, you know, having to take the train and then walking to the office. That was in itself a feat. So that would be my suggestion, to pace yourself.
Thank you very much, Steph. There's a question that I would like to answer because I think it's a fairly quick answer, but it's from Francesca, and it's asking about stroke survivors with more dense weakness and still the same repetition, though it may be passively done by a clinician with encouragement for the person to look. Will this have the same effect? And I think the very clear answer is actually no, that passively doing things to people doesn't make a difference to their brain. It needs to be actively done by the stroke survivor. So where there is dense weakness, what the clinician's role really should be to absolutely explore and persist to find some muscle activity, so that you can even start even with the tiniest, even if it's just being able to push a little bit through the leg, or just being able to start just to protract the shoulder. It has to be actively done by the stroke survivor in order for it to achieve neuroplasticity. And probably the only exception that we have to that is that there is some evidence for electrical stim helping to increase strength after stroke, but probably the best versions of electrical stim is like where Steph was saying, is for it not to be sitting there doing it passively, but where people have really dense weakness, is to use the electrical stim, and for the stroke survivor to really try and move with the electrical stim device. So still have visual targets. Think about trying to hold your hand up after the stimulation goes off, and so that you're really actively trying to work with the machine. But really, what is very clear is that it really is active muscles switching on from the stroke survivor that is really critical.
And if I could just really quickly add, even if that person has absolutely nothing or seems to have nothing as a flicker of movement, maybe that person could just be encouraged to imagine that movement, because when I guess that old therapy of the mirror box, even having this visual cue of what's possible, it's incredible what the brain, once shown what is possible, it can actually achieve that slowly.
Yeah, and we do, and there is some evidence for mirror therapy and for mental imagery. And there is actually a question here from Emma, which could go to either Steph or Brian, which is asking specifically whether you did use mental imagery during your therapy and if that was helpful for you in achieving your goals.
Right.
I think so. No, I didn't use mirror therapy.
Or mental imagery.
Oh, mental imagery.
Yeah.
Yes, I did. I saw myself, and I took inspiration from somebody else in the ward who was there with me, and a lady from Bangladesh, and she was walking one day up and down on a piece of carpet in the gym, and I kept that image in my head because she did it so well that when I started to walk, I had her image. I had that image in my head when I was walking. I thought, no, come on, if you can do it, she can do it, I can do it. It helped motivate me to achieve what the walking part of it. In terms of other, we were doing stepping. There was a student with, I was working with a student, and we were doing stepping, and he wanted me to sort of get to the top of the step and then reach forward. So he had me imagine I was climbing Mount Everest, and I had a flag in my hand. And when I got to the top of the step, I would reach out with the flag and go forward. That was an example, and that really worked, that one. That was about the only time, and it was sort of just like business as usual.
There's a thank you very much, Brian. There's a question to Steph, and it's from Simone Krantz asking, how severe was your aphasia, and was there a time frame for when you became more fluent in your speech?
Yes. Thank you for your question, Simone. It was very, very affected. When I say that I couldn't read or write or spell words or even say any words, I couldn't say yes or no. I remember having to like wiggle my finger to, I think my mom's online, Irene, but I was like trying to like communicate with her to say that yes is, you know, this is yes. Yeah, so I really started from square one. I think I started with like the alphabet, and my speechy, she had to, I think she started with like just the sounds of words, of like S is like soft and Z is like, you know, harder. So that's where I started. Basically, actually, if I can illustrate something and really to prove to you that neuroplasticity really is for your taking, it's just whether you're willing to do the hard yards of like active and big numbers. But my stroke was from a hemorrhage, and I had brain surgery to remove all that blood from the stroke. And essentially there's literally a big like golf football size hole in my head. It's crazy, isn't it? And that basically eradicated my ability to talk or communicate. And yet I'm here, you know, a few years later, talking to you. So it's real. I'm sure the textbooks will update itself in time, but we're here to tell you it's real. And I think in terms of the fluency, I improved my speech well enough after 2 years where people could understand me, and I took that as a sign that I could go back to work. I think when I'm tired, I'm still slurring my words. People sometimes think I'm drunk, so I'm live at the party all the time. But I think around 2 years did I really feel capable, but also, and more importantly, confident. You will be surprised how little my words actually are required to communicate. So yes, about 2 years.
I found with my speech, for quite maybe 2 years after the stroke, in the afternoons when I got very tired, or I got tired, I slurred my words a bit, but also my voice got very husky. I mean, some people might like that, but I found it very frustrating because my wife kept saying, "What are you saying? What are you saying?" I mean, many years ago, I used to work on radio, and I thought, boy, if I could have that voice on radio, but that was, as I've spoken, my vocal cords and muscles have got stronger, and so therefore, at this time of the day, I would be normally very husky, but now I'm quite normal. Yeah.
Oh, Simone, you're on mute.
Yep, thank you. Sorry. There's a question which I think is probably a very pertinent one, which is about how you have dealt with the uncertainty of recovery time. There have been times at the beginning where it would have been nice to know definitively that you were going to get back to independent walking and stuff, but you didn't have that knowledge back then.
You know, it's almost like a bit yeah, becomes more of, okay, stroke will affect you physically, yes, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, it's crazy. It's a
Yeah.
whole, it's all in the kitchen sink.
Yes.
I think to answer this question honestly, I think you need to maybe start understanding that maybe life, your new life going forward, might be a bit different, but it doesn't mean that it can't be better. I see it as my better can be, rather than doing the same thing the same way before my stroke, which is usually a person might, after a stroke, in the acute phase, would see it as success. But I don't really think that it works like that. You are a different person after a stroke. You have different goals, you have different priorities, you see life differently. And I now see success in rehab, in general life, is being able to be happy, to be self-sufficient, dependent, confident, and whatever that looks like to you. I think you can put that into the frame of time frame of better. So yeah, to answer your question of how I dealt with it, it was more, yeah, it was hard to deal with when I realized that even if I got what I went back to, it wouldn't even fit into the person I am now.
Yeah, yeah. If I could just add to that, there is a very much a pre-stroke Brian and a post-stroke Brian. The post-stroke Brian is probably a nicer person than the pre-stroke Brian. He was fairly driven, arrogant, selfish, demanding. Now, with that experience that I had, not the rehab, but the actual stroke and the process of being in emergency and ICU, it gave me a chance to think, and it definitely changed me. I'm much more happy in myself. I'm happy where I am and not where I wrote about this in a blog. I'm happy where I am as opposed to where I'm expected to be by other people. I'm very much, if I could say that, it has changed. And Steph, you're right. Your emotional aspect, your physical, your spiritual aspect, it just goes up in the air. And I've sort of looked towards the Eastern religions more so now. I'm sort of much more of a spiritual person than I was before, and that's in addition to sort of being healthier and all of that. But there's also an awakening. I felt as if I had an awakening in my head about the mental or spiritual Brian. That's getting fairly heavy, isn't it? But we're honest, and that's the other thing. We're honest. Yeah. I mean, we talk about things to a group of people in order to share what stroke survivors go through. They call it lived experience, and if you're not prepared to sort of talk about that and be open about that, I think you're not being true to yourself. So yeah.
There's maybe just a couple of questions that will just cover off, because I think they're still quite important ones. There's a couple just related to, again, are we sure there's no endpoint for even for older people? And yes, I think we can be fairly confident in saying that that even older people beyond 80 years can also significant neuroplasticity, and there certainly is evidence of that. I think brain changes, there is some evidence that it happens more easily in younger people, but there is certainly no evidence, and there certainly is evidence that it can happen in older people. And somebody asked whether there was any specific conditions in which neuroplasticity does not occur. And I'd have to say I'm really not aware of anything in which you cannot any kind of thing that happens within the brain in which there is not some capacity for neural plasticity. Though obviously if you've got progressive diseases like potentially multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's disease, then those are progressive diseases. But we also know that even exercise in those conditions can still make a difference to what people can do. And in something like Parkinson's, we actually now know that exercise can slow the progression of the disease as well too. So I guess that's something just to kind of, I guess, answer that. Those there was a couple of questions there about that. But one of the other questions I'd like to speak to is somebody has asked the question about whether you came across barriers to doing intensive rehab while you were in an inpatient rehab setting. And I guess, well, I'd like to give my advice before I hand over to Steph and Brian. But I have worked myself for a long time in an inpatient rehab setting, and I do travel and teach a lot, so I do see a lot of different inpatient rehab settings. And at times there is a culture that is not encouraging of very intensive rehab. And at times I think there are a lot of barriers to people doing intensive rehab in an inpatient rehab setting. I think you can certainly use the Australian stroke guidelines are very excellent stroke guidelines. And it is very clear in those stroke guidelines that people should be having at least 3 hours a day of scheduled therapy. And they should be given, and there's also another part of that guideline that says that they should be given opportunities to practice as much as possible across the day as well. So I think if you need something to kind of back up a demand for more intensity of practice in inpatient settings, then the guidelines very clearly state significant amounts of practice and opportunities to practice outside of therapy should be provided. But I guess interesting to talk to Steph and Brian too about whether they had any experience of barriers to doing more intensive rehab while they were in that sort of inpatient rehab setting.
If I may step in, Brian.
Go. Yes.
My answer is definitely yes, absolutely. The barriers can be physical, but also psychological. So inpatient rehab, or like inpatient, just to me is you're not at home. You're just, where you're in the hospital or you're in the inpatient ward. The obvious ones are time and resource. I think most people, as the commonality of the population, go to public hospitals, and we know that our public systems are often under-resourced and overrun. So I think I've not really met any allied health person or a therapist who didn't want to give me all their attention and help. But I think because everyone is on this strict schedule, it's just always time and resources that is a barrier. Whereas I think the biggest barrier I had inpatient was actually being told what I couldn't do. And I want to pause to really stress this point, because it turns out that the biggest barrier wasn't even like physical. It was actually my doctor telling me what I couldn't do even before I started my rehab. My rehab doctor, who's meant to be on my side, told me that I would most likely end up in a nursing home if I didn't quite get, my sits and stands quite right, or I couldn't be able to walk independently with my balance. So I would say that's my biggest barrier when I was still inpatient.
I too was in a public hospital, and Simone, you were there for most of the time I was there. I did not the obvious one was resourcing and staffing. The fact that it was open 5 days a week, it could have been open for 7 if. And I asked the question, why aren't you open on Saturday? And they said funding. And yeah, you hear that quite often around in the public hospital system. I was encouraged, I must admit, I was encouraged to the physiotherapy side was that the people who I was working with, they couldn't do enough for me, and they couldn't spend, nothing was a problem or a challenge. The problem with the problem was with the other aspects of rehab, the OTs and the OTs mainly, because there seemed to be a lack of synergy or an understanding, or it was not made aware to me, but there was a lack of understanding of how the dress group and the arm group and the physio group all sort of linked together. They were all sort of functional activities that operated in their own little world. And it wasn't their fault, it was the way in which they were managed by the rehab manager, who didn't quite get that concept. And I felt that sort of had a deleterious effect on a certain part of my rehab. But so therefore I found that the lack of the synergy was, I went off to rehab because I saw I was getting everything and more than what I wanted, rather than going into the arm group or the dress group. So that was that was the only time that I felt shortchanged, if that you could call it that. But overall, it was a question of resources.
Yeah, I think there's a very good message for therapists in that really, optimally, obviously, there should be a really strong multidisciplinary team working together, rather than what Brian observed, which was kind of a very, again, disjointed, if you like, delivery. There's one more. Oh, sorry, I'm just getting a bit conscious of the time. I think there's one more question that I'd like to go to, and I'd like to apologise that I think we're just not going to be able to answer all questions. But there's one that I think is particularly important. Is there a question here about how best can family and friends support a person for them to keep going with their rehabilitation long term?
Well, Steph, you'll have to crawl over me to answer this question, but I really am a disciple of the importance of family in the rehabilitation process. For a start, your eyes and ears as a clinician, when you're not there, they can give you intelligence on motivation, on the mood of the person, how they're travelling. When you're not around, you're at home, they can be motivators, and they can, my family, my daughter, particularly my daughter, she was harder than some of the clinicians in Bankstown, but they are very, very important. They can, they're not just passengers on the trip, on your rehab journey. They are well and truly valuable assets to have, and they quite often they can be the person or the people that stops the stroke survivor from wallowing. They can get them up out of the chair and get them going. Yeah. Over to you, Steph.
I am the direct example of what my family did for me. I'm basically here today as a direct result of my family being the backbone of my recovery. I get to talk to you, everyone. By the way, thank you for staying on. But my mum, my dad, my brother, and myself, we were basically a 4-person regime of like really hard and stringent rehab. And I think to answer the question of how you can support, stroke will change you utterly and completely. And I think just before we start into the physical, let's take a moment to understand that it really does psychologically just take you for a spin. And up to 70% of stroke survivors do seep into depression after, because it does really mess up with your identity. So I would say to keep them positive, be reassuring, be really supportive. You might have to repeat yourself a bit, if not every day, of what your aim goal is, that is pertinent to that person, and just to keep them on the line of what you're trying to achieve. And I suppose the more practical side is, you know, you've had a stroke, you can't remember what day it is. Being with them to those appointments are really helpful, because whatever that doctor tells them, you can just repeat them. You can keep them, I guess, on schedule to other appointments. It's really overwhelming, all of it. So practical, but also be positive, and keep them on the goal that you set for yourself.
I think that's probably a really fantastic note to conclude on. Thank you very much, Steph. So yes, apologies to those. We could be going for another hour, I think, but I think we've answered the ones that really probably were the more broad information that was really useful for everybody. So I'd like to extend an enormous thank you to Stephanie and Brian. If anybody would like to type anything into the chat or anything, if you'd like to.
They can't. The chat.
Or not into the chat, or you can
Yeah.
use the Q&A. A couple of people have used the Q&A already to extend their thanks to you, Steph and Brian, too. And so we'll conclude here with a very big thank you to you both for sharing with such
it's been my
honesty,
pleasure.
your experiences, and such important messages to help the stroke survivors out there with their own rehab journeys as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. I've enjoyed it immensely.